Welcome to the Stoa. I'm going to be your host today. My name is Raven, and I'm excited to be hosting for Scoutleader Wiley, who's going to be presenting on Metamodern Magick, system of theory and ritual art from many different disciplinary backgrounds, drawing from the work of John Vervaeke, Gregg Henriques, Marie-Louise von Franz, and Catherine Bell, among others. Super excited to have her here today to do a presentation with all of us. Once she presents her work, then we're going to go into a Q&A, and feel free to drop questions and comments in the chat. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Scout Leader.
Awesome. Thank you, Raven. I'm really stoked to be here. It's kind of wild, actually. But I guess I'll just get started talking about it so we can jump right into the Q&A. I'd love to discuss this with everyone here because it's definitely not a system that I would say that I invented by any means. It's more so like what's kind of emerging and where it's going and what it's becoming. So yeah, excited to actually hear from people what they think about this phenomenon. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I think I have I do. Okay, great. So Metamodern Magick. Before I talk about what that is, I'm gonna go into what magic exactly is, what metamodernism is, and what these two things together sort of seem to look like so far. I feel it's really only the beginning. But first, magic seems kind of like a weird thing maybe to focus on. Like, why would that be important when we're in like a sense-making crisis and people are, there's a sort of like a breakdown of what is reality and what are we agreeing on what reality is? Are we having a shared reality? Those things seem to be big questions right now. So why would we be talking about something as silly as magic? That might be a question on people's minds. So I don't know if you remember the Kunan Shaman at all. I can't seem to forget about the Kunan Shaman. So, this guy, he was like the poster child for this insurrection thing that happened when people like stormed the Capitol, right? And you can hear even in the language, insurrection, storm the Capitol. It's kind of giving a felt sense of intensity and of mythology. So it's a very compelling narrative. QAnon itself was in fact a very compelling narrative. The idea that there's someone on your side who is gonna stick it to the man for you, right? That's a really compelling narrative that people got really swept up in, started devoting their lives to this sort of live action role play that wasn't really a role play in their minds. So what is so profoundly transformative, right? About some stuff like LARPing for people or RPGs. I don't know if anyone here has ever played an RPG, but these are psychomagical experiences, even going to the theater or seeing a play, right? Versus like watching Netflix at home, profoundly different experiences, but like what makes these experiences so powerful, right? So it has to do with ritual and mythos. So these are not necessarily, like I would argue that these are just these emergent phenomena that come out of these sort of natural properties of human cognition. This is part of how we not only relate to reality through archetype and through story, right? With our, it's part of how we kind of bind moments together, right? In the time binding sense. But it's also how we relate to each other in the world. So we create these stories about ourselves to contextualize ourselves in the world. And we can do this in ways that are maybe not so healthy, as we see with this sort of the QAnon thing and certain conspiracy theories. Certain conspiracy theories are really, really crazy. Some of them actually happened. I just want to point that out. I feel like that's a really important distinction to make. There's a threshold where it becomes kind of it bridges into delusion, and we're all capable of this. We're all susceptible to this because these are aspects of human cognition, right? So we kind of tend to want to either dominate the narrative with by being really, really objective, or trying to be super rational, super practical, materialistic, or we get swept up in the narrative and we lose ourselves in it, right? So this is where magic comes in, right? This is why I'm going to define magic as I see it to you guys today. I define magic as a collection of psychotechnologies. So there's a couple different kinds, right, of magic, and there are a couple different reasons, or there are a couple different purposes, right, for different magical techniques. So you know, individual empowerment, and I use individual to mean in the Deleuzian sense to mean like we are not just like the smallest unit, right, of ourselves. There are also parts of us that we can empower. So different sub-personalities, what, you know, the Jungian shadow and whatnot, or there's an experiential self, and then there's like a persona. So there's all these different elements that when they come together, they create what we refer to as I. So we want to empower all of those parts of us, and we can do so through magic, right? Maintaining social cohesion. So a lot of the rituals that we have, say like in the workplace, you know, give us a sense of like a shared, like a group identity. And that's what helps maintain social cohesion. We kind of have these implicit rules that we all follow that help us feel safe around each other and determine what is and is not acceptable. And that's part of how we deal with complexity, right? Is by actually eliminating a lot of the complexity in our experience and focusing on specific elements of our experience together. Personal development, nervous system regulation, that's a huge one. Creating transpersonal connection, that's a huge one. It's also, you could argue, a state of being, like a way of experiencing the world, the way of seeing the world as a, rather than this scary place that we don't understand. It's this thing that we're constantly unveiling and uncovering this mystery, and so you could see it as we're going on an adventure, right? If you want to have a magical perspective on the world, this honestly just makes life a lot more fun, in my opinion, right? So there are many different kinds of magic. I put Gandalf here, right? And then this is a druid from the Dungeons and Dragons website. And then this is Taliesin, who is one of the, probably the most famous Welsh bard. My personal opinion is that he's cooler than Jesus and we should be worshiping Taliesin, but Jesus was way cool too. So yeah. But yeah, so you have this way of interpreting reality that is based on your personal experiences, and you have these different skills, right, and capabilities. And so that would be like your form of magic. Like, what are your skills in self-mastery? What are your skills in relationship? Some people, you know, like this is a druid, so some people have a really strong connection with like plants and animals. Some people have a lot of knowledge and skill, like a lot of, I think of systems theory actually as like wizardry. That's my interpretation of it. It's more so studying, retaining information, that kind of thing. With someone like Taliesin, his form of magic would be his ability to connect to the universal elements of the human experience and express them through poetry. So these are all like mundane things, right, that people can just kind of do, and they don't think about how they can be used to sort of build a cohesive, inclusive, functional society, right, or to create a value system for the sort of changing times. And I'm just presenting here that we definitely can't, and we can make it fun. All right, so let's get into what metamodernism is and why that's important for this conversation. So first, we need to get clear on what metamodernism is, and that's in a lot of the metamodern spaces that I'm a part of, and I'm just kind of lurking in the background, kind of laughing to myself as people kind of actually try to figure out what metamodernism is and come to an agreement on what it is. I'll give my own personal belief about that. But first, here are, the top four, and we'll the top three. So, what is metamodernism? Is it an artistic movement? Is it a time period? Is it a stage of development? Or is it all of the above, right? So I would say it's actually all of the above. So metamodernism started in the arts and film, and it first emerged in the early 2000s, and since then has kind of taken on a larger influence. The zeitgeist is kind of possessed, right, so to speak, the sort of a lot of Western capitalist countries, and in certain places it's more of a political movement, in certain places it's more of an artistic movement. There's a lot of talk about what metamodern spirituality looks like right now, and metamodern philosophy. So it's really interesting because it's like we're actually looking at the thing, right, as it's being born and growing up, and it's not going to look the same in its teens as it or its early 20s, right? So metamodernism is a 20-something right now, right? And it's not going to look the same as it did when it's a child. But in my personal belief is that we should be looking to the origins of metamodernism, which is in art and film, to get a sense of how this movement is going to be impacting us in the coming years. There are some key principles to the artistic manifestation of metamodernism that we're seeing showing up in different ways in politics and whatnot. And I'm going to talk a little bit next about the elements of metamodernism that show up in what I'm referring to as metamodern magic. So a couple of, that's the blurriest photo I've ever used in my life. I apologize. Yeah. In terms of art, these are just like a couple of different artists and or like aesthetics that I feel kind of get the point across, so to speak, of what metamodernism is, how it feels. It's really important to just look at how it feels. So there's a softness, and there's also an ominousness to this structure of feeling. There's here you have Aurora, who is actually a electronic. She does electronic music. She used to do like acoustic kind of folky music, but now she does electronic music. A lot of her lyrical content has that sort of deep and intense, stark sincerity that is characteristic of metamodernism. And it's in response to the sort of irony and nihilism of the more postmodern kind of like grunge and whatnot way of mode of expression. Here I have Solange, and I feel like, her lyrics get like really deep and sad and existential, but she's got like a quirkiness to her. Like you see the little butterfly clips in her hair. There's this really kind of strange etheric look in her eyes. So there's this hope married to the sense of like impending doom or darkness that's really characteristic of metamodernism. A lot of paradox. People play with paradox. With Sufjan Stevens over here, he's kind of like a metamodern art OG, I would say. He wears wings sometimes in his concerts, and there's a lot going on that's very immersive and colorful. And he talks a lot about like darker aspects of being human in this very innocent way. We have Moonrise Kingdom, which is a Wes Anderson movie where these two kids run away together because they fall in love, and then their parents like go on a hunt for them. And it's really, I think, a really good example of what sincere irony looks like in a movie, because you have the kids who are really, really taking themselves seriously, almost to the point where it's like they're 11 and no one else takes them seriously in their love, but they're really, really intense about it. So there's this sort of, Wes Anderson seems to be exaggerating the sincerity, almost as if he's making fun of it, but he's also acknowledging that it's real. Yeah. So here are a couple of principles of metamodern art that I'm seeing sort of showing up in metamodern ritual art and emergent ritual expression, which are two themes that I'll talk a little bit about towards the end. So oscillation, this is one of the big ones, because it's called metamodernism, I would say, because we're kind of taking a step back and examining not only the current cultural context, but everything that led to the current cultural context. So there's this sense of kind of not really belonging in one place, but kind of being in all the places at once, or just migrating from one place to another. And oscillation is actually a magical technique that I use in meditation to sort of it's kind of like a form of parts work. So, Carl Jung referred to it as active imagination. So you're kind of looking at a part of yourself, and you're looking at your sort of egoic self, and you're talking to that part of yourself. You're kind of going back and forth between the two, kind of looking at the different perspectives within yourself. And you can also do this in group practice as well. So another one is authentic performativity. This one's huge because performance is one of the, Catherine Bell has like a essay where she talks about the six most important elements of ritual that kind of show up not just in traditional ceremonial rituals and religious rituals, but in everyday rituals. And she refers to them as ritual-like behaviors. So performance is one of those characteristics that shows up both in a more extreme sense in ceremony, but also in the everyday life, right? Because we're kind of performing these different parts of ourselves as we move through the world. Authentic performativity is sort of one of these principles of metamodernism, where we're kind of not really sure what the difference between performance and authenticity really is, because in order to be authentic, like, one has to kind of be genuine and be speaking from the heart. But at the same time, a lot of what we're speaking from the heart might not actually really be us, or it might not be a part of us that feels like it's really us, or it's a part of us that is not as much us as we thought, right? So when you're an actor or when you're a performer, the best performers seem to be people that can become the character and convince you that they really are the character, to the point where you don't even maybe know what the actor's name is. You just know them as, oh, that's Uncle Phil, right, from The Fresh Prince, as opposed to like, what's that guy's name? Does anyone know that guy's name? I did at one point, but he's Uncle Phil. So my point here is, with Metamodern Magick, we're kind of, why we're doing this is we're trying to kind of learn who we are and how the context changes who we are. And this can be very empowering. Sincere irony is really important for Metamodern Magick, I would say, because as we kind of stated earlier with the Kunan Shaman, we can get really wrapped up in our personal mythologies. And rather than seeing them as like an interpretive framework that we place on reality just to make sense of it temporarily, just to move through it, it's really like survival programming, if you want to, look at it that way. But it's so real at the same time, right? So we're kind of like, sincere irony is this technique that kind of gets you to not take yourself seriously, but also have reverence for what you're experiencing and see the realness in it, without getting married to it too deeply, right? And self-reflexivity is a huge part of this as well. We're kind of, if we're using magic as tools for personal development, which a lot of people do, what you're wanting to do is become a better version of yourself, right? Or a meme I saw recently actually put it better, I think personally, which was go be your favorite self, right? So it's like, well, who do you want to be? What does the world need? What's the world asking of you? What can I offer to the world, as kind of how I like to frame personal development, as opposed to sort of like how can I be better than everyone else? I mean, if that works for you, that works for you. But yeah, so we're using magic to kind of look at ourselves, change ourselves in the way that we kind of want to be, becoming the person we want to be. Transrationality and what I refer to as a causal representational thinking. So this is how I interpret the sort of rise in popularity of astrology over the past 10 or so years. I remember when I was into astrology, people thought it was like really lame. Like you wouldn't go to a party and someone would ask you what your big three were. Like no one knew what that was, right? And we're kind of seeing a lot of, and then I think like 5 years ago, the sort of like witchy aesthetic became like a huge kind of thing that people were really into it as an aesthetic. And so there's something to the mythology of mysticism that is speaking to people in this sort of new era. Because I think we're beginning to feel the value of that, but we're also we're influenced by the Enlightenment. We're influenced by rationality, by having a more scientific frame of reality imposed upon us and expected of us. So we can't really get away from that side of things, and I argue that we shouldn't, because it's useful. So we're kind of trying to reconcile, the fact that wearing a crystal helps me feel safe, right? If the crystal symbolizes protection, it helps me feel safe. We're sort of needing to have space for that and be willing to understand that that's still very real, regardless of whether or not the crystal's physically doing something. And we might not find out if it does or if it doesn't in our lifetimes. We might find out one day that there's something to that on a scientific level. But for now, let's just be in the mystery, right? Let's just understand that we don't always need to understand. We can be sometimes. And that can be very healing and very useful too. What I'm referring to as systems animism, which is sort of like a neo-animistic frame on reality that's looking at our relationship to objects in a very similar way to how animists look at our relationships to other beings in reality, including non-physical beings, what would be referred to by animists as spirits, ancestors, deities, that sort of thing. We can use that frame and that way of being in the world to help us gain a sense of deep connectedness to reality, regardless of whether or not the spirits are real or the, what have you. I mean, they're as real as you feel that they are, and this is an important way of being and of having reverence for the reality that we're actually in. So it's a little bit different. I won't go into the details of that necessarily right now, but the Fanuc Oasis piece. So Nora Bateson has this paper called the Fanuc Oasis, which talks about how systems can either move towards destruction in ways that we don't see until there's like it's already almost too late, or they can also go in the opposite direction and they can move towards vitality. So this is this sort of like, we don't always know the impact of our actions immediately. We don't always see how our sort of tiny ways of being can culminate and have a ripple effect, right? And so there's this sense of trust that we kind of need to have when we're moving through reality, that our way of being is important, and there's a huge mystery there. And this is sort of a very intuitive and hard to describe space to be in. It's more of a felt sense space to be in, but it's sort of like when you are in meditation, you don't exactly like interpret meditation while you're in meditation. You're just there and you have that sense, right, that something is shifting, but you don't know what it is yet. And you can, of course, eventually come to make connections, but only in hindsight. So that's just something that we need to sink back into, and Metamodern Magick helps us do that. The final thing, this is not necessarily a principle of metamodern art, but it's a principle of a metamodern philosophy. So ritual as an intentional process. So ritual as not just a goal, right? Or an intention or a thing that we do for its own sake, but a thing that we do for reasons that we don't know yet. And this kind of ties into what I was saying earlier with the Fanuc Oasis. An intentional process is defined by what's not there yet. So yeah, the sort of way that we express ourselves through ritual or through performance is really about dancing with a mystery, right? And this is sort of, I think, a good supplement or complement to the sort of sense-making revolution where we are trying to get a clearer understanding of the complexity. As we do this, we of course need to ensure that we can remain embodied and that we can remain in reverence for the reality that our senses are very limited, and magic as a way of being, as a way of still engaging with reality through that limitation and within the boundaries of that limitation. So some examples of ritual art I have here. I'm using Alex and Allison Gray as example because I think they're just perfect examples. Like I couldn't actually think of anyone else that was as good as what they do. So they have a lot of performances that they do. So this one here on the right is called the Goddess, or it's called Goddess. And so what they did was they put I think this is like upwards of 5,000 apples in the shape of a fertility goddess. And then Allison Gray is in the center here where the heart is nursing their daughter. And Alex Gray does 100 prostrations in front of her. And they're essentially trying to give reverence for the earth as like a life-giving sort of being or entity. When they donated the apples after the ritual to a bunch of needy families. So the whole sort of process of what it is that they're doing in this ritual, there are a lot of elements. There's a self-expression element. There's a generosity element. There's a sort of a call to action implicit here of like trying to inspire others to see the world this way, right? So it's very powerful. It's very extreme too. Like they tend to really go there. So this other one where they're walking, it's called prayer wheels. They're walking in a circle and they're bound together by rope painted in gold. They've also got a skeleton and a baby, which is meant to symbolize the connectedness between life and death. Yeah, they go pretty hard. I think they're pretty great examples of how one can use ritual as a tool for self-expression, inspiration, community, and individual transformation. Emergent ritual expression. So these are actually photos of me. I did a ritual that I think is a good example of emergent ritual expression, which is so Alex and Allison Gray are a good example of like ritual art with a lot more intention behind it. So there's like a plan. There's like, we're going to do this and this is how we're going to do it. And we're offering that to the world in a specific structured way. Emergent ritual expression is more like, I got an idea to make a honey jar, a protection honey jar. And I kind of just followed my intuition on it. I went into my sister's photo studio and just kind of got a bunch of things together and just followed, the inner authority of where am I going to place this and what am I going to do here? And I went and bought honey because that was just what was coming through. Did the ritual. As I was doing it in real time, it became clear what I was actually doing and why. So with emergent ritual expression, it's more of a process of self-discovery, of understanding your own personal mythology more deeply, so as to embody it more authentically and more in service. Okay, so this can be said to be like a neo-bardic tradition. That's my interpretation of it. I think there's probably more to it. A lot of this is just based on my experience of it and what I'm seeing of people that are close to me. So of course I'm going to have a bias about that. But essentially, to sum things up, it's sort of a movement that blurs lines between mysticism and art in a very open way. Make art is mysticism, art is magic. We're using it as a psychotechnology, as I said earlier. I do think that this can empower us to have actually more discernment in contexts like that are cult-like, because we already understand the tactics that are being used. We understand how rituals work. We understand the parts of the body, mind that are being activated. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, cults won't happen. It just means that we as individuals and as collectives, hopefully, will be able to operate within the sort of mythic realm in a more empowered way. So I don't think I think I kind of already went over that. Okay. I think that will be all from me. And I think I'm ready to take any questions now.
Fantastic. That was an excellent presentation. It was amazing, super compelling. Yeah, I loved your examples. So everyone, feel free to throw your questions in the chat, or I guess you could raise a hand too, if that's more comfortable for you. Either way.
Yeah, there's already like, I'm gonna look at.
Yeah, there's comments. There's some comments and stuff. I'm gonna let us go to the audience because we only have a little bit of time here. So I'm gonna call on Ka. You can tell me how to say your name.
I put in the chat as well. It doesn't matter. So you had intentional in the slides, and I was wondering because I also love so much, and I would love to bring this also in here. There's an article by Jermaine Marvel, and he wrote about the ghost and the environment, and he replaced the environment with the environment, containing ourselves within this. And I was just thinking of that when I read intention, because it was the other way around, and I'm very curious of what you did there.
Yeah, yeah. So I actually did not come up. That's a Terence Deacon word. And so Terence Deacon has this book called Incomplete Nature, where he talks about various things. It's super dense. I haven't finished it, obviously, because of its density. I'll probably be reading that book for the rest of my life. He talks about intentionality and how it's with an E, and how it's different from intentionality with an I. So he sort of talks about processes that are defined by the absence of something. And that's kind of how I'm using that term in the context of ritual. So that's the difference between ritual art, like as Alex and Alison Gray are doing it, where they are following a structure that they've set out. And it's like choreographed dance versus improvisational dance, right? So with the emergent ritual expression, it's an intentional process because I don't know what the purpose, I don't know what the final cause is until I've finished doing it, right? Until I've met my goal. Does that make sense? Does that clarify? Okay, great. Thank you.
Wonderful question. Greg.
Yeah, that was really fantastic presentation. And I guess I just have some thoughts, not specifically a question. But so as somebody who is very involved in the discourse around metamodernism coming from the art and aesthetics world, I think that what you're talking about fits right in with that. I very much see the connections. And I appreciate kind of how you've spelled out the connections there. And one thing that occurred to me was, while I was listening to you, is magic is almost, could be considered a principle of metamodern art and cultural phenomenon, except what's sort of uniquely metamodern in this expression of magic is like, if you think even of some of the examples you gave of the metamodern art, like Sufjan Stevens and Wes Anderson, like in almost every scene, in almost every Wes Anderson film, or in almost every Sufjan Stevens song, there is a sense that the characters or the characters in the song or whatever are living life as if there's magic in the world. However, it doesn't involve spirit beings and fairies and sort of like your standard idea of what's magic. It involves quirky personality traits or impossible missions that they dedicate themselves to, or investing like ridiculous amounts of meaning in mundane objects, and things like that. So I think there's actually a sense of magic implicit in even the kind of conventional art world academic sense of metamodernism. And then what you're doing is you're pulling that out and taking the metamodern, oscillation between irony and sincerity and all that stuff, and then bringing that out in the much more explicitly magical kind of symbology and ritual. That's how I see the connection.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as an interpretation. I would say, yeah, what my personal technique of interpreting what metamodern magic is to take the principles of metamodern art and apply them to esotericism, right? But what you're saying about metamodernism being sort of an inherently magical structure of feeling, I think is part of why that's easy to do. Because it's already, there's a sense that the mundane sort of, the Royal Tenenbaums is not like a super, like it's just about a family, but there's something about the family where it's like, oh, but like they're all geniuses, right? And so there's something a little bit, right, because Wes Anderson is just such a good example of metamodernism. It's like, I don't want to keep falling back on him, but I just have to.
He has 10 movies, or 9 movies. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of fodder there for interpretation. There's something really special about the family, even though they're just a family at the same time. So there's the overlap between the magic and the mundane that you're speaking to there. And yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up and synthesizing that. I agree with what you said.
Cool. And then while I'm here, another thing I wanted to suggest is, have you heard of Jeffrey Kripal? So if you have the time to take on reading some of his work, he's a scholar in religious studies. And I
always had time for religious scholars.
Okay. So he was the graduate school advisor of my thinking partner, Linda Ceriello, and she explicitly writes about metamodern religion and spirituality. And what some of Kripal's work is, he's documenting and exploring people's engagement with the supernatural. And he approaches it in a way where, like, he himself is not committed to taking one stand or the other in terms of the truth claims of the people's experience, but simply forefronting their interior experience, their felt experience of what they call supernatural. And I'm not going to waste a lot more time, talking about that, but that's just a pointer. Like, if you have time, look up Jeffrey Kripal. And then through his connection with Linda, he's starting to incorporate metamodernism theory into what he does, although it's not really strong yet in his writing. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, Moses.
Sorry, I was I didn't realize where my mouse was. So I'm just going to sort of pose the question I just popped in the chat here. When you mention Metamodern Magick as a neo-bardic tradition, Do you mean it more as an information transmission technique, as entertainment, or something else? I'm more familiar with kind of old school bardicism. I might have accidentally uncovered a past life memory or something at some point, and I kind of associate it heavily with information transmission and entertainment sort of at the same time. So do you mean like bardic in like the Dungeons and Dragons sense, where like it's also capable of creating some magic, or are you or is it more rooted in real world definitions of bardic profession, I guess?
Yeah, I love that question so much, Moses. Thank you. In classic scout leader fashion, it's all the things. So yes, I'm very inspired by actual bards like Taliesin. I'm also inspired by the sort of Dungeons and Dragons version of what it means to be a bard, where you get, you have inspiration. So you're kind of channeling. That's what the New Agers call it. But I think it's a pretty good term, actually, because like the felt sense of what's happening so I'm actually a musician, I'm a songwriter, and the felt sense of what's happening as I write a song is that like I am being taken over by something bigger than myself. I think that's huge in the sense of the D&D bard and their experience and their actual value to the party that they're in, is being able to kind of like use inspiration as a tool, as a weapon, as healing, that kind of thing. I am also using it as a way of information transmission. Like you're transmitting the felt sense to the people around you when let's say I'm doing a performance. I'm playing music, right, at a concert. What's actually happening at a concert is the person performing is embodying something, and the other people in the room are seeing themselves mirrored, or they're not, right? So you don't like the music, you're not seeing yourself mirrored, your soma is not engaged, right? And you'll probably leave the room to go out for a smoke or something. But if that person says a lyric, right, that takes you back somewhere deep inside of yourself, you're going to see yourself in them. And that's kind of why we have so much hero worship with celebrities, right?
Yep.
Is because we're seeing parts of ourselves are being called out of us, right? So if we can engage with, like in the ritual art context, if we can engage with that, knowing that the ritual artist is a channel, right, for whatever's in the room, we can learn a lot about ourselves. So yeah, information transmission, entertainment, because why not, right? Humans love dicking around. I think we should own it. And yeah, there's a depth, and there's also a playfulness and a lightness to it when I call it a neo-bardic tradition. Thank you so much. Great question.
Yeah, that was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure, Ray, if that's a question for Scout Leader in the chat. If it is, you can go ahead and answer it, or ask it if you'd like.
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering if what you're talking about is a little bit like the flamenco notion of duende, like this idea of like in flamenco, when you shout ole, it comes out of it comes from Allah, like God is coming through the vessel. And so when you see an incredible flamenco performer who ceases to be the dancer, but becomes the dance, that's when ole is shouted. So I'm wondering if what you're talking about is similar to like Lorca's conception of duende.
Yeah, that's great. I didn't know that was the meaning behind that word, and that's so badass. I appreciate you bringing that in. Yeah, absolutely. Well said. I would say so, yeah.
Amazing. Kevin, you want to ask your cue?
Is it in the chat? Because I can just go ahead and scroll.
Yeah, it is in the chat.
Okay, is it okay? Should I read it? I'm just gonna read it out loud.
Yeah, go for it.
So Kevin says, fellow emergent ritualist here, do you have any practical advice on how to bring something personal developed in a solitary context into a more group setting, or sharing it with others? Yeah, that's a really great question. That's definitely a question that I'm I'm exploring now, actually, because I have, for the most part, done emergent ritual alone, and I've seen emergent ritual take place, but most people don't know that that's what they're doing. So bringing the awareness that what we're doing is an emergent ritual is not something I have experienced before very, very recently. I don't know if I could answer your question, but I would definitely encourage you to explore it and bring your answers in. Because I want to connect with more emergent ritualists. Most of the ritualists that I know think that ritual has to be something that's already been created in a specific lineage or tradition, and then they follow it. And they don't see how emergent ritual is a form of ritual. So like they don't see themselves as even performing a ritual. So bringing in that awareness that this is an emergent ritual, I think will already kind of attract collaborators to you, and then you'll discover, you know, what that looks like in community, and that will be really exciting. Thank you for that.
Wonderful. Max.
Hello. So what is supposed to emerge as a consequence of an emergent ritual?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What is supposed to emerge as a consequence of a ritual that you are performing?
An emergent ritual?
Uh-huh.
So let me see if I'm interpreting your question correctly. Are you asking like what is the purpose or the goal? Like what is the end goal of an emergent ritual?
Yes, sometimes magic ritual is meant to put something out there into the world and manifest some desires. So what is the aim of emergent rituals?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question.
Because you said it's about understanding your own world, I suppose, but is there an intention behind this?
But that's the thing, is that with an emergent ritual, this is sort of why I'm referring to it as an intentional process with an E, is because the final cause is not determined prior to the action. Does that make sense? So there isn't an answer yet as you're doing it. The answer unfolds as you perform the ritual. The ritual, you could see it as like the ritual is revealing itself to you. And when the ritual is finished, it will continue to reveal itself to you. You might not understand it for years. You might not know why you did it for years. And that's the key difference between, like, say, more traditional forms of ritual, a more intentional form of ritual art, intentional with an I, form of ritual art, and then an intentional with an E form of emergent ritual expression. Cool. I hope does that clarify for you?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Sweet. Sorry.
Yeah, I would just like to probably build on what you just said and the question and the way that that we are in this world is it's a metaphor, and it's sincere, and it's multiple purposeful at the same time, right? If we are in that what wants to emerge and create something as if and in a playful way, it has multiple purposes, right? It's communication, it's expression, it's art, it's communication with myself and communication with what is not myself, if there is something that is or is not. And it's like Nora Bateson refers to it like as the antlers of the deer. How did the antlers come into the world? How they have multiple embeddednesses and stand for multiple things. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, well said.
Wonderful. Cool. So we're gonna try and get to the final questions here. Marie-Andrea, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course.
I I have a question, but I don't really know how to ask it, so I'm going to try and I might fail. I guess it's about some sort of like barrier or blockage or resistance to the emergent ritual, which is sort of connected to something you were mentioning, and I've been thinking about in terms of, I don't know, like this sort of idealizing the kind of rational, like in the sense-making, complex thinking community kind of space, and like this kind of like, you know, wanting to be a complex thinker, and like a space where maybe everyone, I mean, all of us in some way, because it's like highly valued collectively, kind of want to be Daniel Schmachtenberger. So, you know, and doing the whole, and so how that's sometimes sort of having an expectation or a structure or something to fit in order to be able to hold complexity can block like your own way of holding that complexity and allowing that ritual and that emergence. And so my question kind of is like, I don't know, like, how do you, like, I'm curious about how has that experience been for you, maybe, if you can relate to some of that, like sort of thinking that there's a way to do like the complexity and the making sense, and how that can sometimes be in like contradiction with allowing your own kind of expression, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So this is why I like to use the Dungeons and Dragons kind of structure as a metaphor, is because if we have an entire party of Daniel Schmachtenbergers, we're going to fail the campaign immediately, right? Like, we need him, right? We need people who think like that. And I like how Daniel Schmachtenberger has actually become a mythic figure. Like, we're not even talking about him anymore. I just want to highlight that we're not, right? So Raven Connolly, I referred to her as the dark mother of the liminal web, right? She's actually just a human being that I don't know at all. I saw like one or two of her interviews and I was like, mythology, right? Because that's how we relate to people that we don't actually have an embodied sense of. So we need to get clear that what we're doing is we're mythologizing of all of this, right? This is a story, we're in a D&D campaign. It's like probably the biggest party that we've seen in a long, like, I've never seen a party this big, right? But we're gonna have factions. We're gonna have, I spoke with Joe Lightfoot, and I was like, we need to start coming up with like guilds so that people stop trying to fight each other over how we should be doing this. This whole sense-making, metamodern, integral, new value system emergence thing.
Lawrence Curry Clark has brought guilds in like 2 years ago or a year ago or something like that. He's mapped it all out. The feasters, yes, and the coders and the searchers, and it's all there.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Ka. Yeah. I think when you're willing to be what it is that you are and that you know that you're skilled with, and you can see specifically where you fit, what your value is. It's a very pragmatic, sort of almost detached, but it's also very self-loving at the same time, kind of like, what am I here to do? What can I offer to this party, right? As opposed to like, we should all be doing it this way because this is the best way. Like, what way is the best for what context, and what ways complement each other, right? Because like, let's say you have like a wizard, which is what I like to like, that's my mythology for the sense makers, right? And then you have like someone who's like really great at mapping, but not so good at conflict resolution, right? Don't put that person in conflict resolution. You're gonna have a bad time, right? If you're great at conflict revolution, if you're great at conflict resolution, go out there and be, right, the warrior, right? Go embody that archetype and see what that's like, and learn about that, and offer what you're discovering to people who are skilled with mapping, and see what they say, and see how they're then using that information. So we're exchanging information. We're skilled at receiving and interpreting certain types of information more so than others because we have biases, right? So how do we use our biases in a positive way? Is sort of like my frame on it. If that makes sense. Don't be something you're not. TLDR.
Be your authentic self.
Right.
Yeah, which is like an emergent process. You don't know where you're going. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It seems
Totally.
like a level of coherence. Okay, we're gonna sneak in David. Thank you, David, for being our last question.
Thank you for getting to me. I actually feel like a lot of what I was going to ask was pointed to by Maria Andrea and then answered just there. Because I'm very much in this space right now where I'm figuring out my own personal development and coming into this kind of like dropping the need to understand everything and have this propositional framework through which to perfectly grasp all of the complexity that is going on so that I can know exactly where I'm going and I can figure out exactly the right step and blah, 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 blah. So this very like, just totally overwhelmed propositional mindset. I'm just really dropping that and coming into this, like living this understanding that the participatory embeds the propositional. And if you want to explicate it, you can do that later. So you really answered a lot of what I was going to ask, which was how to strike that balance between knowing enough that you're not going to stumble off a cliff, but not needing to know so much that you handicap your own efforts to grow by preventing yourself from just emerging naturally as you're drawn to do so. So yeah, I guess there's not a question anymore. It's really just like a thank you for the framework, for everything you brought here, because I feel like you just struck a really resonant balance between enough theory but not so much theory that it starts to be this thing that you're anxious about understanding it and you're anxious about following all the threads to make sure that you've got all the context and all the terms figured out and so on and so forth. This is just very alive for me. So
yeah,
this is not a question anymore, I guess, but thank you.
Great closing remark.
Beautiful, wonderful. Scout Leader, do you have anything you want to leave with us before we disperse to the rest of our days?
Yeah, well, what David was just saying reminds me too of I guess like a final remark would be your fears, right? Often kind of what I've noticed is that they lead you, if you're like kind of trying to figure out what it is that you are supposed to be doing, your fears are really good at helping you figure that out. So this kind of like our fears often motivate us to cultivate our skills, right? Because we're trying to armor against the thing we don't want to happen. So if you're afraid, you might be, you might not be, you might just be speaking generally here, but I say you generally here. If you're afraid that you won't know enough and that's going to lead to a negative outcome, so you sort of gather information, right? That's going to lead you to, okay, so what is the skill I'm cultivating here? Therefore, what do I have to offer? Maybe I can help protect people because I have this wealth of information, right? So yeah, it's great that that there's an awareness there, it sounds like, of what can impede your growth, but also what can just lead you to it, what is already kind of leading you to it. So just wanted to give that little tiny non-dual sprinkle there before closing out.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, I can feel the energy in the room. I think you're really hitting something here. I really appreciate the whole framework and the playfulness, and excited to see what emerges. Surprise, surprise. So thank you so much for visiting us at the STOA. I'm glad Peter was sick so I could host you.
Yeah.
What a wonderful surprise. Yeah, so, and I'll just let everyone know that tomorrow, a woman that I'm starting to get to know, her name is Pamela, she's coming to do a presentation on living with Eros. So that's going to be tomorrow at noon Eastern time. So please come to join us. I think it's going to be an incredible session. So very similar flavor to what you're doing as well, Scout Leader. So thank you everyone, and have a beautiful day.
Bye, friends.
Bye.